Lauren Mitchell announced with ice-cold precision as she pointed toward Andre Williams in front of 200 Apex Technologies employees gathered for the quarterly all-hands meeting, her voice carrying across the corporate auditorium where a black custodial worker had just committed the unforgivable sin of quietly correcting technical information that the CEO was presenting incorrectly about their building's security system architecture. The words hit the room like a physical slap, not because firing was unusual in corporate America, but because the public humiliation was so deliberate, so calculated to demonstrate that hierarchy mattered more than accuracy, that a CEO's ego trumped a janitor's expertise, regardless of who was actually right about technical systems that could affect everyone's safety. "Ma'am, I apologize for interrupting your presentation," Andre had said 60 seconds earlier, his voice carrying the careful deference that 42 years of navigating white corporate spaces had taught him was essential for survival. "But the security system you're describing uses manual override protocols, not the automated fail-safes you mentioned, and that distinction matters for emergency evacuation procedures." At 42, Andre Williams possessed the kind of invisible technical knowledge that characterized former aerospace engineers whose careers had been destroyed by personal tragedy rather than professional incompetence. His hands still remembered the precise wiring configurations for NASA security systems. His mind still processed failure modes and backup protocols, but his heart had learned that no technical achievement mattered compared to being present for the twin daughters who had already lost their mother to his workaholic priorities. "I don't need a janitor teaching me about systems in my own building," Lauren had replied, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her designer suit projecting authority that came from inheritance rather than expertise. "Your job is to clean floors, not to embarrass me in front of my employees with technical details you couldn't possibly understand." "Ms. Mitchell, I understand the system because I helped install it 7 years ago when I worked as security systems engineer for NASA contractors," Andre had explained, using careful language that acknowledged his background without sounding defensive or challenging her authority in ways that could escalate the confrontation. But the revelation had made everything worse, not because Lauren doubted his credentials, but because a custodial worker possessing expertise that exceeded her own understanding represented the kind of status threat that insecure leaders eliminated through public destruction rather than private conversation. "Security escort, Mr. Williams from the building immediately," Lauren had commanded, her voice carrying the controlled fury that characterized people whose power depended on never being contradicted regardless of factual accuracy. "His employment is terminated effective immediately for insubordination and disruption of corporate communications." The termination was both legally questionable and morally devastating. Andre had been trying to prevent potential safety failures, not to challenge Lauren's leadership, but corporate hierarchy treated correction as rebellion when it came from people whose job classifications made their expertise seem impossible or threatening. As security guards approached to escort him out, while 200 employees watched in silent horror, Andre felt the familiar numbness that had characterized his life since Michelle's death. The recognition that speaking truth to power always resulted in punishment, that trying to protect others from preventable disasters just made you the problem rather than the solution, that the universe had already taught him through his wife's death that good intentions were worthless against institutional indifference. "Daddy, why are you home so early?" 9-year-old Sophie asked when Andre arrived at their modest apartment at 3:47 p.m., her twin sister Sarah looking up from homework with matching expressions of concern that children developed when they learned their surviving parents' emotional state determined their family's stability. "I lost my job today, baby," Andre replied, using the gentle honesty that single parents learned for explaining adult failures to children who deserved truth without being burdened by complexities they couldn't process or control. Did you do something bad? Sarah asked with 9-year-old directness, her question reflecting the child logic that assumed job loss indicated moral failure rather than institutional cruelty or power dynamics that had nothing to do with competence or character. No, sweetheart, I tried to help someone understand something important about building safety, and they didn't want to hear it from someone like me, Andre explained, providing age-appropriate framework for understanding class discrimination without teaching his daughters that their father's expertise was worthless because corporate hierarchy said so. The afternoon dissolved into familiar routines, helping with homework, preparing dinner, reading bedtime stories. While Andre processed that unemployment meant their precarious economic stability could collapse into homelessness or food insecurity if he couldn't find new work quickly enough to cover rent and childcare costs that consumed most of his modest income. At 11:47 p.m., as Andre sat alone reviewing their dire financial situation while his daughters slept, 3 sharp knocks on his apartment door shattered the quiet desperation that had been his constant companion since Michelle's death, had taught him that the universe didn't care about good people or loving families. Opening the door revealed Lauren Mitchell, not in her designer suit, but in torn, soot-stained clothing, her perfect blonde hair singed and wild, her face streaked with tears and blood, her ice-blue eyes carrying the kind of primal terror that came from witnessing catastrophic disaster that could have been prevented if arrogance hadn't silenced expertise. "The building is on fire," Lauren gasped, her voice breaking with panic and desperation. "The security system failed, exactly like you said it would, and 40 people are trapped inside, including my brother David. And the automated locks won't release because the manual override protocols you tried to explain aren't working, and you're the only person who knows the emergency codes because you installed the system." The words came out in a desperate rush that made clear she wasn't here to apologize for public humiliation or wrongful termination. She was here because the expertise she had dismissed as impossible for a janitor to possess had become the only thing that could save 40 lives, including her own brother's, and her arrogance had created disaster that now required her to beg for help from the man she had destroyed hours earlier. "Ms. Mitchell, there are 40 people trapped in a burning building, and you came here instead of calling the fire department?" Andre asked, his mind already processing the technical failure modes that could prevent emergency responders from accessing override systems that required specific engineering knowledge to bypass. "The fire department can't access the override systems without the installation codes," Lauren explained, her voice carrying desperation that transcended her earlier cruelty. "The system defaults to maximum security lockdown during fire conditions to prevent panic evacuation that could spread the fire, and only someone with the original engineering specifications can bypass the protocols." The explanation confirmed that Andre's earlier warning had been accurate. The security system was designed with protocols that prioritized controlled evacuation over immediate escape, meaning that system failure during fire conditions would trap everyone inside until someone with specific technical knowledge could manually override the automated lockdown. "My daughters are asleep and I'm not leaving them alone," Andre said, his voice carrying the absolute priority that had governed every decision since Michelle's death had taught him that no work obligation justified abandoning his children. "Call someone else with the technical specifications." "There is no one else," Lauren replied, her desperation escalating to something approaching hysteria. "You were the lead engineer on the installation contract, and when you left NASA, the company didn't maintain proper documentation. And now 40 people, including children, are going to burn alive because I was too arrogant to listen when you tried to warn me. Duh. The moral calculus was impossible. Andre could wake his traumatized 9-year-old daughters and drag them to a burning building where their father would risk death to save strangers. Or he could refuse and let 40 people die because protecting his own children mattered more than strangers whose CEO had publicly destroyed him for trying to prevent exactly this disaster. Some discoveries about institutional failure reveal that expertise dismissed through arrogance becomes essential during crisis, and that moral choices sometimes require deciding whether protecting your own family justifies allowing others' families to burn when you possess knowledge that could save them, but would require abandoning the children you've already sworn to prioritize above everything else. The choice that would define Andre Williams' character and haunt him regardless of his decision required confronting the most painful truth about Michelle's death. Not that car accidents were random tragedy, but that she had been driving home at midnight from overtime work that Andre had asked her to cover, because he was in the middle of critical NASA security system installation that couldn't be interrupted for family scheduling. "Daddy, why is the pretty lady crying?" Sophie asked from the doorway, awakened by Lauren's desperate voice, her 9-year-old presence transforming Andre's impossible choice into something even more complex, because now his daughters would witness whatever decision he made about valuing strangers' lives versus maintaining the absolute family priority he had sworn to uphold after Michelle's death. Andre felt time compress into crystallized moment, where past trauma and present crisis collided. Michelle's face, the night he had asked her to work overtime, the phone call at 2:17 a.m. informing him of the accident, the funeral where he had promised their daughters he would never again prioritize work over family presence. "Sophie, go back to bed, baby," Andre said, using the gentle authority that single parents learned for protecting children from adult complexity, while recognizing that his daughter's presence had already made the choice more impossible, because whatever he decided, she would remember this moment forever. "But Daddy, the lady is hurt," Sophie continued with the 9-year-old empathy that hadn't yet learned to prioritize tribe over strangers. "Don't you help people who are hurt?" The question carried Michelle's voice. She had been emergency room nurse whose entire identity had centered on helping people who were hurting, who had worked overtime because patients needed care, who had died because Andre's work priorities had made her choose between family and service. "Ms. Mitchell, I need you to understand something," Andre said, his voice carrying controlled emotion about circumstances that made every choice a betrayal. 3 years ago, my wife died driving home from overtime work that I asked her to cover because I was too busy with NASA installation project to handle childcare scheduling. I promised my daughters at her funeral that I would never again prioritize work over being present for them. I understand, but 40 people, including children, are going to die if you don't come, Lauren replied, her desperation making her honest in ways that privilege usually prevented. "I know I have no right to ask this after what I did to you, but I'm begging you to save my brother and those families, even though it means breaking your promise to your daughters." The moral framework was both clear and impossible. Refusing meant 40 people burned while he maintained promise to his children. Accepting meant breaking that promise, but saving lives, including children, whose parents had already made different choices about work-life balance than Andre's guilt had dictated. "Sophie, go wake your sister," Andre said quietly, making the decision that would either redeem or compound Michelle's death, depending on whether the technical knowledge he had gained through her sacrifice could now save others from similar loss. "We're going to help the pretty lady save people from a fire." The drive to Apex Technologies took 17 minutes that felt like hours, with Sophie and Sarah sitting silent in the back seat, processing that their father was breaking fundamental promise about family priority, while Lauren rode in front, providing technical details about system failure that confirmed Andre's earlier warning had been exactly accurate. "The fire started in the server room at 10:23 p.m., Lauren explained, her voice carrying professional assessment mixed with personal terror. The security system interpreted the smoke as potential chemical attack and triggered maximum lockdown protocols that sealed all exits with electromagnetic locks that require manual override codes to release. "How many children are trapped inside?" Andre asked, his engineer mind processing technical solutions, while his father heart prepared for emotional consequences of whatever happened next. "6 children between ages 7 and 12, Lauren replied, her voice breaking. "They were attending after-hours coding class that my company sponsors for employees' families, and now they're trapped with their parents because my arrogance prevented me from implementing the safety protocols you tried to recommend." Dit-il. The revelation meant that Andre's choice wasn't abstract moral philosophy, but immediate reality. 6 children approximately his daughter's ages were currently experiencing the terror of being trapped in burning building, and their survival depended on whether Andre's technical knowledge could override systems that his expertise had made him uniquely qualified to bypass. Arriving at Apex Technologies revealed chaos, fire trucks, police vehicles, paramedics, and desperate families whose loved ones were trapped inside the burning building, while emergency responders tried unsuccessfully to breach security systems that had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of forced entry that rescue required. "Mr. Williams, I'm Fire Chief Robert Martinez," said the incident commander, recognizing Andre from Lauren's frantic explanation. "We need manual override codes to release the electromagnetic locks, and the system manufacturers say only the original installation engineer has access to the bypass protocols." "Chief Martinez, the override codes are physically located in the building's mechanical room on sub-level 2, Andre explained, his NASA training making him methodical despite emotional urgency. "Accessing them requires knowing specific routing through maintenance corridors that bypass the security lockdown. But getting there means going into a burning building while leaving my daughters outside." Udin. The explanation made clear that saving the trapped families would require Andre to enter the fire, navigate through smoke and structural collapse risk, access technical systems in areas where heat and oxygen depletion could kill him, all while his traumatized daughters watched from outside, knowing their father might not return just 3 years after their mother had died from similar work priorities. "Daddy, you have to save the kids," Sarah said with 9-year-old moral clarity that cut through Andre's complex adult calculations about promise-keeping and trauma management. "Mommy saved kids at the hospital, and you should save kids too, even if it's scary." The observation carried Michelle's values translated through their daughter's understanding. Emergency room nurses ran toward danger to save strangers' children, and their family's identity had always involved service that sometimes required sacrifice. "Sophie, Sarah, I need you to stay with Chief Martinez while I go inside," Andre said, kneeling to his daughter's eye level for what might be final conversation. "If something happens to me, you need to know that saving those families doesn't mean I love you less. It means I love you enough to teach you that sometimes keeping our promises means breaking them when other people's children need help. Some moral choices require understanding that grief can teach either isolation or service, and that honoring dead spouses sometimes means breaking promises made in their memory when circumstances demand choosing between protecting your own trauma or preventing others from experiencing similar loss, and that children who witness such choices learn either that survival justifies any selfishness or that love sometimes requires risking everything to save strangers who need the expertise that your personal tragedy uniquely provided. The mechanical room on sub-level 2 of Apex Technologies existed in a hell that engineering textbooks described theoretically, but that human bodies weren't designed to survive. Temperatures exceeding 800 degrees Fahrenheit, smoke so thick that visibility measured in inches rather than feet, structural groaning that suggested imminent collapse, and the constant awareness that every second spent searching for override codes was a second closer to orphaning his daughters, the same way Michelle's. Death had orphaned them of their mother. Andre moved through the smoke-choked corridors wearing borrowed firefighter gear that felt inadequate against the heat radiating through concrete walls, his NASA training providing mental maps of mechanical systems, while his father's heart screamed that this was exactly the kind of work priority that had killed Michelle, choosing strangers' emergency over his own children's presence. Williams, you have approximately 4 minutes before structural integrity fails in your location. Chief Martinez's voice crackled through the radio. The fire has compromised the support columns on level 3, and when they fail, the entire mechanical room will collapse. Doom. The time limit transformed technical problem into impossible race. The override panel was located behind equipment that required moving. The codes needed to be manually entered into a system whose touchscreen was probably damaged by heat, and extraction would require retracing a path that might not exist if structural collapse occurred while he was still inside. Outside, 9-year-old Sophie and Sarah Williams stood beside Lauren Mitchell, watching their father disappear into smoke and flame, processing that the promise he had made at their mother's funeral, never prioritize work over family, was being broken in real time because 40 strangers' lives had somehow become more important than keeping his word to the children who had already lost one parent to work obligations. Your daddy is very brave, Lauren said to the twins, her voice carrying guilt about recognizing that Andre's heroism was occurring specifically because her arrogance had created this disaster. He's saving a lot of people, including children like you. Our mommy was brave too, Sophie replied, with 9-year-old directness that carried accusation more powerful than adult rage. She saved people at the hospital, and then she died in a car crash because Daddy made her work late. Now Daddy is saving people for you, and maybe he'll die too, and then we won't have any parents. The observation hit Lauren like physical violence, not just because it was accurate, but because she was directly responsible for creating circumstances where Andre's choice was between maintaining family promises or saving lives, including children whose parents had made different choices about work-life balance than Andre's guilt had dictated. Inside the mechanical room, Andre found the override panel behind a server rack that required moving despite heat that made metal surfaces capable of causing third-degree burns through protective gloves. His hands, the same hands that had held Michelle's in the hospital as she died, that tucked his daughters into bed every night, that had installed these exact security protocols 7 years ago when work had seemed more important than family presence, now struggled with equipment that his expertise made him uniquely qualified to bypass. The touchscreen is heat-damaged, Andre reported through radio that was starting to fail. I need to manually wire the override using backup protocols that require accessing the system's internal components. Williams, you don't have time for manual override, Martinez replied, his voice carrying professional assessment that survival required immediate extraction. We need you to abort and evacuate before structural collapse. Chief, if I abort, 40 people including 6 children die, Andre said, his voice carrying the calm that characterized people who had already decided that some choices were worth dying for, even when daughters were watching from outside. My girls have already lost their mother. At least let them know their father died saving other children, rather than abandoning them like I abandoned their mom. The statement revealed how completely Michelle's death had transformed Andre's understanding of moral obligation. He had spent 3 years believing his absence during her fatal drive meant he had failed as husband and father, and now saving strangers' children represented some kind of redemption for priorities that had gotten his wife killed. Working with heat-damaged wiring, while structural groaning suggested imminent collapse, Andre's NASA training provided muscle memory for procedures that his conscious mind could barely process through smoke inhalation and oxygen deprivation. Each connection required precision that was difficult when gloves were melting and visibility was measured in shadows rather than clear sight. "Daddy's been in there too long," Sarah said outside, her 9-year-old voice breaking as she processed that her father might die the same way her mother had. Choosing work obligations over family presence, leaving his daughters orphaned because strangers' emergencies mattered more than his children's need for parents who stayed alive. "Your father is doing something incredibly brave," Lauren replied, though her words felt hollow when spoken to children who were learning in real time that bravery meant orphaning them for people they'd never met. "He's saving families like yours from losing their parents." "But we're losing our parent to save them," Sophie observed, with devastating logic. "How is that fair?" The question had no good answer. Andre's choice was between his daughter's concrete loss and strangers' potential loss, between keeping promises made at gravesides and preventing other children from standing at similar graves, between protecting his own trauma and preventing others from experiencing similar devastation. Inside the mechanical room, Andre completed the final override connection as structural groaning escalated to sounds that suggested immediate collapse. The electromagnetic locks throughout the building released simultaneously, doors that had trapped 40 people in burning structure suddenly opening to allow evacuation that should have occurred automatically if Lauren had listened when Andre had tried to explain system vulnerabilities. "Override complete," Andre gasped into failing radio. "All locks released, beginning extraction." Nay, but the extraction path that had been barely navigable 4 minutes earlier had been compromised by structural collapse. The corridor that Andre needed to use for escape had been blocked by fallen ceiling panels and twisted support beams that created obstacles requiring climbing over unstable debris, while smoke inhalation was making coordination difficult and heat exhaustion was affecting judgment. "Williams, you need to find alternate extraction route," Martinez commanded, his voice carrying controlled urgency. "Your primary path is blocked by collapse, and we're reading dangerous structural instability in your location. The alternate routes required navigating through areas where fire intensity made survival unlikely, where oxygen depletion could cause unconsciousness, where every step risked additional collapse that could trap him permanently in the hell his expertise had required him to enter, while his daughters watched from outside, wondering if their father loved strangers more than he loved them. Some sacrifices require understanding that choosing to save others doesn't make you a hero to the children you're risking orphaning, and that technical expertise can become moral burden when it means you're the only person capable of preventing disasters that require abandoning your own family to save strangers whose CEO created the emergency through arrogance that your correction couldn't penetrate. The extraction that should have taken 2 minutes stretched into 12 as Andre navigated through smoke-choked corridors where structural collapse had transformed familiar mechanical spaces into death traps, requiring decisions about which unstable debris could support weight and which obstacles required dangerous climbing that heat exhaustion made increasingly difficult to execute with precision. "Daddy!" Sophie's scream penetrated through the chaos as Andre finally emerged from the building's emergency exit, his firefighter gear charred and smoking, his face covered in soot that couldn't hide the oxygen deprivation that had turned his lips blue, his hands trembling from combination of heat exposure and adrenaline crash that characterized people who had just survived circumstances that should have killed them. The reunion was simultaneously joyful and complicated. Sophie and Sarah crashed into their father with desperate hugs while simultaneously processing that he had risked everything to save strangers, that the promise made at their mother's funeral had been broken, that work priorities had once again nearly orphaned them despite 3 years of assurances that family would always come first. "You promised you wouldn't leave us for work," Sarah said through tears, her 9-year-old voice carrying betrayal that was more devastating than any adult accusation because children's trust was absolute, until it shattered. "You said after Mummy died that we were more important than any job. Baby, I know I broke my promise," Andre replied, kneeling despite exhaustion to meet his daughters at eye level for honesty that children deserved even when truth was complicated. "But 6 kids like you were trapped in that fire, and I was the only person who could save them. Sometimes keeping our most important promises means breaking them when other people need help we can give." The explanation was both ethically sound and emotionally insufficient. His daughters needed father who stayed alive more than they needed moral lessons about service and sacrifice. But circumstances had forced choice between their concrete needs and strangers' desperate emergency. Meanwhile, Lauren Mitchell was experiencing her own reckoning as 40 evacuated employees, and their families processed that they were alive specifically because the janitor she had publicly fired for, correcting her technical ignorance, possessed expertise that her arrogance had nearly made inaccessible when their survival depended on it. "Ms. Mitchell, my daughter is alive because Mr. Williams risked his life to override systems that you incorrectly claimed were automated," said Jennifer Torres, senior software engineer whose 10-year-old daughter had been trapped in the coding class. "You fired him this afternoon for trying to warn you about exactly the failure that almost killed 40 people tonight." And the accusation was accurate and damning. Lauren's public humiliation of Andre hadn't just been cruel. It had nearly resulted in mass casualty because institutional hierarchy had made technical correction seem like insubordination rather than potentially life-saving expertise that deserved consideration, regardless of the messenger's job classification. "I need to speak with Mr. Williams privately," Lauren announced, recognizing that public apology would be inadequate for circumstances that required actual accountability rather than performative contrition designed for reputation management. "Ms. Mitchell, I don't think private conversation is appropriate right now," Andre replied, his voice carrying exhaustion and awareness that whatever Lauren wanted to say would be complicated by the fact that his daughters were processing trauma while dozens of witnesses expected resolution that simple apology couldn't provide. "Mr. Williams, I need you to understand that I'm not here to apologize. I'm here to offer you position as Chief Safety Officer with full authority over all building systems and security protocols," Lauren said, her proposal representing institutional recognition rather than just personal contrition. "What happened tonight occurred because I prioritized ego over expertise, and preventing similar disasters requires systematic changes that start with recognizing that technical knowledge exists throughout organizations, regardless of job classifications." The offer was both generous and insufficient. Andre needed employment, but accepting position from the woman who had publicly destroyed him hours earlier created power dynamics that made genuine professional relationship difficult. When institutional hierarchy remained fundamentally unchanged despite crisis intervention. "Lauren, before I consider any employment offer, I need you to understand something," Andre replied, using her first name deliberately to establish different terms than their previous relationship had allowed. "My daughters just watched me nearly die saving strangers because your arrogance created disaster that my expertise could prevent. Any professional relationship we develop needs to acknowledge that my family's well-being is non-negotiable and that technical corrections aren't insubordination. They're exactly what you should expect from people whose knowledge could save lives if institutional culture permitted honesty rather than punishing hierarchy violations." D. The statement established boundaries that employment relationship would require. Andre's expertise was valuable, but his daughter's needs were absolute, and any organizational culture that made technical honesty seem like career risk would eventually create disasters that no individual heroism could prevent. Over the following days, as media coverage transformed the Apex Technologies fire into national story about class dynamics and institutional arrogance nearly causing mass casualty, Both Andre and Lauren faced questions about whether their collaboration could transcend the viral moment that had forced them together through crisis rather than building trust through sustained relationship. Mr. Williams, how do you feel about the CEO who fired you this afternoon, begging for your help saving lives tonight? Asked reporter Maria Santos during the press conference that Apex Technologies had organized for damage control and public accountability. I feel the same way I felt when my wife died, because I made her work overtime. That institutional priorities about what's important create disasters that technical expertise can sometimes prevent but can't undo after tragedy occurs, Andre replied, his honesty about Michelle's death providing context that made the fire story into broader commentary about work-life balance and systemic values about human dignity. And Ms. Mitchell, how do you respond to accusations that your arrogance nearly resulted in 40 deaths, including children? Santos pressed, recognizing that Lauren's accountability required more than scripted apology. I respond by acknowledging that Mr. Williams tried to warn me about system vulnerabilities this afternoon, and I fired him publicly rather than listening because I couldn't tolerate correction from someone whose job classification made his expertise seem impossible, Lauren replied, her honesty unusual for corporate crisis management that typically minimized rather than acknowledged institutional failures. The public accountability created viral moment that transformed their story from simple disaster narrative into examination of how class assumptions prevented organizations from utilizing expertise that existed throughout their hierarchies, and how crisis often forced recognition that should have occurred during normal operations if institutional culture valued accuracy over hierarchy maintenance. As their collaboration developed through safety protocol redesign and organizational culture change, both participants understood that preventing future disasters required sustained commitment to employee expertise recognition rather than just individual professional relationship between CEO and former janitor, whose technical knowledge had saved 40 lives because crisis had temporarily overridden the hierarchy that had made his warning seem like insubordination. Some alliances require understanding that crisis collaboration doesn't automatically create trust when institutional power dynamics remain fundamentally unchanged, and that preventing future disasters requires systematic cultural transformation rather than just individual relationships between people whose expertise and authority were forced together through emergency that shouldn't have occurred if organizational humility had allowed technical honesty to prevent catastrophe before 40 lives depended on last-minute heroism. The crisis that would determine whether Andre and Lauren's collaboration represented genuine institutional reform or just crisis response performance reached its breaking point 6 weeks later when Apex Technologies' board of directors, led by Lauren's father, founding CEO Richard Mitchell, launched vote to remove her from leadership while simultaneously attempting to eliminate the safety reforms that had emerged from the fire disaster. Lauren, your emotional response to the building fire has resulted in excessive safety spending that threatens quarterly profitability and shareholder returns, Richard announced during the emergency board meeting that would determine whether institutional change survived beyond viral moment. The safety officer position you created for Mr. Williams costs the company $300,000 annually in salary and system upgrades that our insurance carriers don't require. And the accusation transformed life-saving reforms into evidence of poor business judgment, treating Andre's expertise as unnecessary expense, rather than recognition that his knowledge had prevented 40 deaths, including 6 children, whose survival apparently mattered less than quarterly earnings reports. Father, the safety reforms have prevented 3 additional system failures in 6 weeks that could have resulted in injuries or deaths, Lauren replied. though her defensive tone revealed awareness that institutional resistance to change often emerged after crisis urgency faded into normal operations, where cost-cutting seemed more important than disaster prevention. But Lauren, preventing theoretical disasters doesn't justify actual expenses that affect real profitability, Richard continued, using business logic that treated human lives as acceptable risks when prevention costs exceeded insurance liability calculations. The board pressure was simultaneously occurring while Andre faced his own confrontation with institutional limits, not from corporate hierarchy, but from his daughters, whose trauma about nearly losing their father had manifested in school behavioral problems and nightmares that suggested his heroism had taught them that strangers' lives mattered more than their need for parents who stayed alive. Mr. Williams, Sophie and Sarah have been acting out during class and expressing anxiety about you dying at work, reported their school counselor, Ms. Patricia Chen, during emergency meeting that revealed how Andre's choice to save 40 people had created lasting psychological damage for the two people whose well-being was supposed to be his absolute priority. What specific behaviors are they exhibiting? Andre asked, his voice carrying guilt about recognizing that breaking his promise at Michelle's funeral had consequences beyond that single night. Sophie has been having panic attacks during fire drills, and Sarah has been asking teachers if their parents prioritize work over family, Ms. Chen explained, providing evidence that 9-year-old twins were processing their father's heroism as abandonment rather than moral courage. They keep asking if you're going to die saving other people's kids the same way their mom died working overtime, Ms. Chen continued, revealing how completely Andre's daughters had internalized the connection between parental work priorities and family tragedy. The assessment forced Andre to confront that his decision to enter the burning building, while morally defensible and technically necessary, had traumatized his daughters in ways that therapy might not resolve, teaching them that their father's promises were conditional on circumstances and that strangers' emergencies trumped their need for parents who chose family over heroism. As both Lauren and Andre faced institutional resistance to sustained reform while processing personal costs of their collaboration, the viral story that had made them temporarily famous was evolving into backlash, suggesting that Andre's heroism had been reckless endangerment of his own children, while Lauren's reforms were performative overreaction to disaster that her own negligence had created. Mr. Williams, Social Services has received complaints suggesting that your decision to enter a burning building while your daughters watched constitutes child endangerment, reported the caseworker who arrived at their apartment for investigation that could result in custody review or mandatory parenting classes. I made a choice to save 40 lives, including 6 children, Andre replied, his voice carrying exhaustion about defending moral decision that had required choosing between his daughter's concrete needs and strangers' desperate emergency. But, Mr. Williams, your daughters are exhibiting trauma symptoms that suggest your choice prioritized strangers over your own children's psychological well-being, the caseworker continued, using child welfare logic that treated heroism as parental negligence when it created anxiety for children who had already lost one parent. The investigation revealed how completely institutional systems failed to process moral complexity. Andre's expertise had saved lives, but his daughters had paid psychological price that social services measured as potential neglect rather than tragic necessity when disaster required impossible choices. Over the following days, as Lauren faced board removal while Andre confronted custody investigation, both participants understood that their alliance had created vulnerabilities that institutional power would exploit unless they found ways to demonstrate that sustained reform served organizational interests beyond just preventing disasters that might never occur. Andre, I need you to understand that if the board removes me and eliminates your position, the safety reforms we've implemented will be reversed within months, Lauren said during their strategy meeting about surviving institutional backlash. And Lauren, I need you to understand that my daughters are having panic attacks because I nearly died saving your brother and your employees, Andre replied, his honesty about personal costs, acknowledging that their collaboration had extracted prices that neither of them had anticipated when crisis had forced them together. What if we're both wrong about what this situation requires? Lauren asked, her question suggesting recognition that their alliance might need restructuring rather than just defending. What if preventing future disasters doesn't require your daily presence, risking more trauma for your daughters, but instead requires training others to have the expertise that institutional culture made invisible until crisis forced recognition? The proposal represented evolution from individual heroism to systematic capacity building. Andre could share knowledge without risking his life repeatedly. Lauren could demonstrate institutional commitment without depending on a single employee whose family circumstances made sustained risk-taking psychologically damaging. Some confrontations require understanding that crisis heroism doesn't automatically translate into sustainable institutional reform, and that preventing future disasters sometimes requires choosing systematic knowledge transfer over individual expertise. Retention, when family costs of continued risk-taking exceed organizational benefits of maintaining relationships forged through emergency rather than trust. 18 months after the Apex Technologies fire had forced impossible choices about family priorities versus stranger survival, Andre Williams stood in the training facility he had designed, not as employee risking his life during emergencies, but as consultant teaching 200 safety engineers the technical expertise that had once been invisible because custodial work had made his knowledge seem impossible until crisis had proven his warnings accurate. The transformation was both personally redemptive and institutionally significant, since Andre's transition from emergency responder to systematic educator had created replicable frameworks for safety protocols that benefited thousands of buildings while allowing him to honor both Michelle's memory and his daughter's needs through teaching, rather than repeatedly risking orphaning them during disasters. Mr. Williams, this training has identified 17 system vulnerabilities in our clients' buildings that match the failures you prevented at Apex, reported his business partner, former Fire Chief Robert Martinez, whose collaboration had transformed crisis response into proactive prevention through combined expertise in engineering and emergency services. At 44, Andre possessed integrated professional identity that characterized people who had transformed personal tragedy into community benefit. His expertise was still valuable, but his daughter's well-being was absolute, and his work now served both priorities through knowledge sharing rather than individual heroism that had traumatized Sophie and Sarah while saving 40 strangers. Chief Martinez, what I've learned through this experience is that preventing disasters requires making expertise accessible before crisis rather than depending on individual heroism during emergencies, Andre replied, using language that honored both his NASA training and the hard lessons learned through Michelle's death and the fire that had nearly orphaned his daughters. Meanwhile, Lauren Mitchell was experiencing her own continued evolution as her leadership of Apex Technologies had survived board challenge through demonstrating that safety investments generated measurable returns in insurance costs, employee retention, and corporate reputation that exceeded the quarterly expense reports her father had used to argue for reform elimination. Lauren, the safety protocols you implemented have reduced our insurance premiums by 42%, while generating positive media coverage that increased client contracts by 18%, reported CFO Thomas Bradley during their annual review of institutional changes that had emerged from the fire disaster. Additionally, The Employee Expertise Recognition Program has identified capabilities throughout our organization that have improved operational efficiency and created internal advancement pathways that reduce turnover costs by 23%. At 38, Lauren possessed earned authority that characterized leaders who had been transformed by their own failures into advocates for institutional humility. Her privilege was still intact, but she had learned to use it for equity creation rather than hierarchy maintenance, understanding that her father's resistance to change had been wrong but not permanent if she chose sustained commitment over comfortable retreat. Thomas, what we've created isn't just about fire prevention. It's about organizational culture that recognizes expertise exists throughout hierarchies and that technical knowledge should be valued regardless of job classifications, Lauren replied, using framework that extended beyond individual crisis response to include systematic recognition of employee capabilities. As their professional relationship evolved through Andre's training business and Lauren's institutional reforms, both participants understood that preventing future disasters required collaborative commitment to knowledge democratization rather than just individual relationships between CEO and former janitor, whose expertise had been revealed through crisis. Over the following months, Sophie and Sarah Williams were completing their transition from traumatized children, processing near orphaning, into resilient preteens, whose therapy had helped them understand that their father's choice had been both terrifying and necessary, that adults sometimes faced impossible decisions, and that family love didn't require perfect promise-keeping when emergencies demanded choosing between concrete and theoretical losses. "Dad, my teacher asked me to explain why you went into the burning building," 11-year-old Sophie said during their evening conversation, her question reflecting growing capacity to process complex moral situations that had seemed like simple abandonment when she was 9. "What did you tell her?" Andre asked, recognizing that his daughter's understanding of that night would shape their values about service and sacrifice for their entire lives. "I told her that you saved 6 kids who would have died, and that even though it was scary for Sarah and me, those kids' parents got to keep their children because you were brave enough to break your promise to us," Sophie replied, her 11-year-old wisdom reflecting therapeutic work that had transformed trauma into moral framework. "And I told her that Mommy would have done the same thing because she was a nurse who saved people even when it was dangerous," Sarah added, her contribution connecting Andre's choice to Michelle's values in ways that honored both parents' commitment to service. The conversation revealed how therapy and time had allowed his daughters to integrate their father's heroism into family narrative that honored both Michelle's memory and Andre's choice, without requiring them to pretend the night hadn't traumatized them, or that promises broken during emergencies didn't carry real costs for children who needed parents to stay alive. 3 years after the fire, Andre stood at Michelle's grave with Sophie and Sarah, no longer alone in processing grief, but accompanied by Lauren, Chief Martinez, and 15 families whose lives had been saved that night, all gathering to honor the woman whose death had taught Andre that work priorities mattered less than family presence, but whose values had also required him to save strangers' children, even when it meant risking his daughter's security. "Michelle, I don't know if saving those 40 people made up for not being there when you needed me," Andre said to the gravestone that had been his companion for 6 years. "But I think maybe you would understand that sometimes keeping promises requires breaking them when other people's children need the expertise that our tragedy uniquely provided." Lauren stood quietly beside the families whose survival had created this unlikely community, understanding that her arrogance had nearly caused mass death, while Andre's expertise, dismissed because custodial work made it seem impossible, had saved lives, including her brother David, who now ran Apex Technologies' expanded safety division. "Mr. Williams," said Jennifer Torres, whose daughter had been trapped in the coding class. "Emma is starting engineering school next fall because she says she wants to learn how to make buildings safe like you did. You didn't just save her life that night, you showed her that technical expertise can serve people regardless of whether they can afford to pay for protection. Some families are created through shared commitment to preventing tragedies that technical expertise can stop when institutional culture values knowledge over hierarchy, and the most meaningful professional legacy often emerges from transforming personal loss into systematic change that serves communities rather than just processing private grief, while accepting that heroism carries costs for children who need parents to stay alive, and that sustained institutional reform requires choosing knowledge transfer over repeated individual risk-taking when family well-being depends on fathers who prioritize presence over perpetual crisis response.